Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is the final video covering the 2016 World Chess Championship match between our current champion Magnus Carlsen and challenger Sergey Karjakin. 12 games, 12 classical games are now in the books, which brings us to this final day, a day of tiebreaks or playoffs, which consists of rapid games, a best of 4 rapid games, if necessary, blitz games, and if necessary, an armageddon game. The time controls for the rapid games, as you see here, 25 minutes with a 10-second increment. There is no additional time throughout, no bonus time at move 40, no bonus time at move 60. What they start with here is pretty much all they have to complete the game. So they are playing at a faster pace for sure, and I anticipate covering these games in this video at a little bit of a faster pace as well, which might make it for a little bit of a more interesting video, and hopefully could bring a little bit more life to the games as they were played live. And I guess I also had to take into account my voice, which is definitely wearing. So let's hop to it and see what went on in rapid game number 1. Karjakin with the white pieces kicks off with e4. The tiebreak games, these games were all played on November 30th, 2016. e4 is yet again met by e5, and we have a Ruy Lopez. Big surprise. Even in the faster time controls, these guys are playing their favorite opening, let's say, of the match. Let's see where we have some change. a6 and knight c3. We've seen this idea earlier in the classical time controls, but now something different. Knight to b8, freeing the pawn up. This e-pawn, he's soon to contribute. A little repositioning going on, we can say, for both knights here. White's knight drifting towards the king side. c5's now in. Knight g3, knight c6. This pawn kills the knight. Rook to b8. A little prep move, flight square for white. Black is grabbing some queenside space, and now white says, you can go no further. I don't want you to clamp down on this gap in my position. b4 is in. This pawn, it's important he stay put. He has a very important job to control both b4 and d4. Keeps the knight under control. Rook to e1, bishop to e6 comes with a threat to take, and after the recapture, to capture on c3, and white will not be in a position to recapture with a pawn. Just to show, this would be the threat. White would now have to take with the queen, and now this knight has a couple of very interesting options. So therefore, bishop c4. Now, the reply is h6, doing similar. Flight square for black's king, just as h3 did for team white. If black captures the bishop, this is a good doubled pawns. This doubled pawn is quite good, right? The c3 pawn I would identify as one of the best pawns for team white, controlling the knight, and white would have some play along the d file. Black understands this. In fact, neither side really wants to saddle their opponent with doubled pawns, we might say. White had the option to do this, but the rook would be brought to life, and after bishop to c4, black has an option to do this and double white's pawns, but that would bring some major pieces to life. Could even see the knight dropping into d5 a couple different ways he can get there. So neither side makes a bishop capture. This tension between the bishops is maintained. h6 it is, bishop to e3, completing development. Queen to e2, rook to d8. Something is soon to happen with d5, so this is where we now have a chain reaction several exchanges, pawn exchanges, piece exchanges, bishop takes, f takes. It's interesting to note that this capture is only made once the f file does not have a rook on it. So after bishop takes, black could very well take with the queen, but takes with the pawn. Watches over some squares, both d5 and f5. And now comes d4, so some action in the center. Aside from the light square bishops off, there hasn't been any other exchange, but we're about to see a lot. First, b takes c, making sure the rook is brought to life, and only then capturing on d4 a bunch. There go a pair of knights, and now here comes that rook. Planting up in white's position, exerting a lot of pressure on both the pawn, the bishop, e4. How does white react? Rook on e to c1, the rook on a has a job. Queen is hit, queen d7. Strikes at a4. Initially I didn't see this. I was only focused on the queen staying put on d7 to defend e6. But there is a punch being thrown at a4. Bishop c3 hits the rook. Rook takes a, bishop takes a. The queenside pawns are gone, aside from the d6 pawn. So really the attention turns towards the king side. One rook is exchanged. Rook a8, bishop c3. Both rooks are now gone. Kingside specific position. Slow improvements here with queen c6. King h2, getting out of any rank checks. And black is improving the king slightly to watch over e6. That's no longer a sensitive point. Not quite sure how exactly white would try to target that, but he's taking a step towards the center. Bishop to b2. White's just staying super solid, having everything defended here. Queen c6, f4, and now black is looking for some mating idea on g1. In comes e5. Black doesn't necessarily have to react with a capture or a knight move. Black can play bishop to b6 straight away, but goes in for a capture first. D takes e, bishop bishop b6, a mate and 1. How to defend g1, queen d1. Defends and stays on an open file. Many possibilities. Not that she would want to go anywhere along the d file, but still a very active post for the queen back on her home square. Queen to d5. Queen takes queen, knight takes queen, and this is as far as we go in rapid game 1. The players agreed to a draw. Not much excitement in this endgame. Everything is on the king side. It's a completely equal position. Nothing to really play for in this position. If we have a quick look at the tail of the tape, we can see pretty level throughout. No inaccuracies, mistakes, or blunders for Karjakin. 5 average centipawn loss. 1 inaccuracy on Carlsen's end. No mistakes, no blunders. And the same, 5 average centipawn loss. Okay, that brings us into game number 2. Rapid game number 2. Colors reversed. Carlsen now on the white end. Let's see what we would have. e4, e5, another Roy Lopez, not quite. An Italian game. We saw this once in the classical time controls. Let's see how play follows. Let's get to some action in the middle game. White has some idea to grab some queenside space. I believe we had that in the classical game in this match. c3, very useful, maybe d4, maybe b4. And d6, rook e1. That bishop move is there to anticipate either pawn advance with tempo. A little flight square for Team White, very useful move. Often a prerequisite to playing a d4 strike, so that you don't have to worry about bishop g4. White would like to maintain the knight on f3 if d4 is in there, so h3 is common before a d4 advance. Knight to e7, looking at the g6 square and preparing c6. White now strikes in the center. Knight g6 is there just in time to defend e5. Here comes the queen knight. c6. And now bishop to f1. I believe this is an important moment because, just to illustrate, if white makes a passing move and does nothing, keeps the bishop on c4, let's say, this is an opportunity for black to maybe capture on d4 and then follow up with d5. And after the smoke clears, what has just happened? Well, white now has an isolated pawn. Okay, this is one of the ideas, or at least can be one of the ideas, to change the structure with this c6 move, to chop and then follow up with d5. Black doesn't go for this. Well, excuse me, white doesn't play king to h1 here, but instead bishop to f1. At least you're getting out of a d5 strike and opening up a new square for the knight. Without the knight move, the queenside pieces simply don't play. So in comes a5. This is preventing white from maybe grabbing some queenside space. This pawn, a white pawn on a5, can have a bit of a clamping effect on the queenside. It would observe, we can say, one of the holes in black's position, namely b6. So now d takes e, d takes e, queen c2 first, maintaining queens, and only next playing knight to c4. Black gets on with some development. Knight c4 strikes at e5 now twice. It's only defended once. Black's now there a second time. And now in comes b4, some pretty direct play. Something needs to happen on a5. A takes b, c takes b. So now this becomes a very sensitive point. d4 is maybe the weakest square in white's camp. Bishop, pawn, soon a rook can observe that square. White has to be a bit careful. Fortunately, has a knight there to defend that square. Now comes b5. Knight to e3. If white takes first, then eventually, after queen takes queen, the knight will be forced to retreat. White finds it better to simply maintain the tension on b5. You have to move the knight at some point, so white moves him right now instead of initiating a capture first. So knight to e3, both of white's knights are in those key 16 squares in the center. B takes a, rook takes, bishop takes knight, and now we have bishop takes bishop. So white is giving up a pawn with this variation. White can recapture with the rook and defend e4, but he has some deeper idea in mind. Let's see what that is. Bishop takes bishop is most natural, developing a new piece. But now the e-pawn is going to fall. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook. Queen was overloaded, having to watch over rook and pawn. Knight takes e. Black is now up a pawn. Where is white's compensation? Well, immediately, my eye points towards the bishop pair. And, well, after rook to c1 now, black has to go a bit on the defensive. Bishop to d5. Second defender now against c6, but now comes b5. What to do here is black. White is threatening to maybe push or capture. Obtain a passed pawn. How to deal with this? C takes b. Now, if rook takes queen, pawn takes queen. There's no way that white can be better here. Black has an extra pawn. 2 extra pawns. There's no guarantee you get this guy back. So what's the idea? Queen takes knight. Bishop takes queen, that would be no good, because of rook takes queen. And in the end, white is up a minor piece. Black has 2 pawns, but black is losing. So what's the idea here? After queen takes knight, what does black do? Queen takes rook. Queen takes bishop. Now the queen is hit, and so too is the pawn. After the smoke clears, what do we have here? 2 bishops versus a rook and pawn, imbalanced position. What's the way forward? Rook to b8, queen to d5, rook to d8, queen to b3, rook to b8, queen to a2, and now black gets a flight square in there. White wants to keep queens on the board if possible. There's a nice piece on e3. This knight on g6 is a bit clumsy. White's looking to attack the king somehow. Let's see how he could try to stir up some trouble. Queen d5, queen e7, queen e4, and now we have g3. The knight will not be able to make use of F4 or h4, and soon he could be kicked with h4, h5 ideas. So there's not really much that black can do but sit and wait. Rook to c8, kind of like a passing move. Not really a great way to improve. Let's see what white tries. Bishop to d3, a slight improvement for the bishop. Black wants a queen exchange. White says not so fast. Queen f5, rook e6. Frees up the queen. She doesn't have to defend the rook anymore. Bishop e4, queen e6. White says no. Knight e7, and black knows that he's giving up a pawn. And apparently he's okay with giving up the pawn just to ensure that the queens get off. White goes for it. Queen takes e, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, knight g6. Bishop takes knight, and now rook takes knight. How do we stand in this position? It is a two bishops versus rook. No longer a rook and pawn, but just a rook. So can black hold this? It's pretty clear right around this point white is playing for two results. A win or a draw. This is a super piece, the bishop on e3. How can white try to make some progress? Let's see what approach is taken. Now f6 is providing a square for the white bishop and king. And this is something that white looks to get to. King g2, king f3. Just from this point on, it's a lot of shuffling with black. Not really a good way to improve. The idea is to just keep the king in the corner and always try to keep the rook in a position where he's either giving check or questioning one of the bishop positions. So let's see how white tries to make some forward progress here. First task is to try and get the king to cross the fifth rank. White needs the help of the dark square bishop to do this. Pivoting on c5, and now he's able to cross on the fifth rank. White is slowly making some progress here. The king is a little bit more active, we can say. And instead of the bishop being on g6, it's the white king who now occupies that strong post. The king, all of a sudden, is a bit short on squares. And what might not be long off are some mating ideas. The king and two bishops converging on the G7 square. Let's see. Rook b2, bishop to f5. Was this a mistake by white? The bishop was hit, and now the f-pawn is picked up. Now take note of the times. They are ballpark times. 4 minutes and change, just under a minute for Karjakin. Both are in time pressure. So easy for either side to go wrong here. Bishop e6, king h8, bishop to d6. If black is not acting fast, bishop f8, bishop g6. Bishop g7. That's mate. So black has to interfere with this idea. First questions the bishop. We have bishop to g4. This is a mistake. A better move, instead of dropping back with the bishop, is king to f7. This would have been a win for white, playing king to f7. As an example, rook b2, preparing to question the king position. This can be met with bishop f8, threatening pretty much a mate in 2, just to show. Check, and then mate. Rook f2, king to f7, rook to f2, and bishop to f8. This is the mating idea. Bishop takes pawn, bishop to f5, so what could follow is rook b7, king to g6, and just making a passing move to illustrate, rook to a7 can now be met with bishop f7. And what is this doing? It's cutting off the rook's defense of g7. So this is the key idea, key configuration of the white pieces to generate a very serious threat of mate. So this would have been the way forward for white, is what I'm getting at this moment here, when black played rook to e2 to play king to e7, bishop to f8, and then again eventually converge on the g7 point. That didn't happen, and so a big advantage was thrown away here on this move 62 with bishop g4. It's now 3 pawns versus 2, and let's see what more is tried here. We've already seen Karjakin be a super defender in games 3 and 4. Are we seeing another very good defense in rapid game number 2 here? Let's see. Bishop to b1. No. g3 is defended there. Black is just shuffling a little bit. Let's see what white tries. This was a very lengthy rapid game. Bishop f8. After king to g8, we have bishop to b4, rook to b7, and it's hard to blame either side right around this point. They're basically in bullet mode, right around a minute left on the clocks. Rook to b7 is a big blunder, but a move that white does not capitalize on. I'd like to show what the winning idea here from this position would be for white. Black, right around this point, has it in his mind to simply stay on the 7th rank, so it's really tough to see. I doubt that either player saw the following way forward in this endgame, but it's quite interesting. This is what white could have done. In the game, he played bishop to d6, Carlsen played bishop to d6, but here is a winning continuation. Bishop e6, king in the corner, bishop to f8 with, again, that idea of bishop to f7. f5 captures, and on h5 there's f6. This is actually not the most complicated way to show an advantage for white. In just a few more moves, that's the one that it gets a little bit more complicated. This would be the winning continuation, however. f6, bishop f7, and again we have this idea of mate with bishop to g7. And how do you stop that? You have to pitch the rook, and in the end the big question is, do you have the right color bishop? Yes, you do. The rook pawn, we have the right color bishop. He's able to control that queening square. This will be a win for white. White did not go in for this variation, playing bishop e6. Instead, bishop to d6. We repeat a little bit, bishop to f8, king to g8, and now we have bishop to a3. So this right here was one other way that white could have won from this position after king to g8, and this is the one that is a bit more complicated, and it's hard to see how either player would see the way forward from this position, but this was pretty neat. Notice bishop e6, and now all of a sudden the king can't move, and the rook can't move off of the 7th rank. Why? Because of bishop f8 and bishop to f7. So if I'm to just make a passing move, rook to c7, bishop to f8, and now we have f5, and a similar story here with just capturing and going with bishop to f7 and the capture on g7. What more can black try here? After bishop to f8, king to g8, bishop to c5, and suppose rook to b8. So this is the variation that I wanted to highlight, this winning method. After king to h8, both bishops working on adjacent diagonals. We have this move h5 with now the idea to play g5. This is what I wanted to highlight. This scenario here, this pawn break, this winning idea is one that I would be very surprised if either player saw with so little time. h5 and now g5. Pitching a pawn for what reason exactly? Well, let's see. Let's consider both pawn breaks. And yeah, black better go in for one of the two, as otherwise white is crashing through, winning a pawn. And so let's consider this one first. On f takes g, there's now bishop d7. What's black to do? There's only two ways to defend the g pawn. Mate in one threatened, but both of those squares are covered by the bishops. So the rook would have to give himself up. And once more, white has the correct color bishop to eventually escort the queen pawn to promotion. The other capture at this moment is h takes g, but now in comes h6, preparing mate. With pawn takes g7, g takes h is now met with bishop e7, threatening mate here. Rook to g8, and simply king takes pawn, and there's no stopping. Bishop takes pawn and mate soon thereafter. g4, chop, and checkmate. Cool sequence. Can't blame either side for not seeing that continuation with h5 and then a g5 break, but just goes to show how dominant a strong king position, having the king on g6 and both bishops on board, very powerful force. Bishop a3 was played in the game, move 75 now. King h8, bishop e6, rook b6, king f7. We have a check, and after this block, now black takes this opportunity to play now h5. It's a top move, very strong move, and now there is no chance for Team White. What's the idea? Well, after g takes h, now we have two rook pawns. So what's the most important bishop in this position? It's the dark square bishop. You need to keep him around if you're going to have any winning opportunity, but guess what? He's going to be captured soon. After f5, bishop takes, rook takes bishop. In the end, white cannot win this. Doesn't matter how many rook pawns you have, it's not going to be enough. White does not have the correct color bishop to score a touchdown. King g8, king h8, pawn pushes, and regardless of how white captures the pawn, we now have stalemate. The bishop was there, the pawn is now here to control h7. This game goes to the very end. No draw by mutual agreement, simply stalemate on board. Black is not in check, and black has no legal moves. Rapid game 2, drawn, and what is this? Now the third game by Karjakin, where he has found a way to be annoying, to put up a very strong defense. How is this influencing? This was a big question of mine. Is this influencing Carlsen in any way, that yet another game is, slipping away? He had his opportunity, but yet again, Karjakin has shown he is master of defense. So, going into game 3, let's see what we would have. Actually, before I do that, let me show you the tail of the tape with rapid game number 2. So here we go, having a look at the evaluation. We can see that there was some advantage right around the point of c takes b5, black's move 23, and soon we had that imbalance, two bishops versus rook and pawn, a pawn and a half advantage, and then once we got to that endgame, the two bishops versus the rook, this was a winning advantage, and then some of it was thrown away, and there was an opportunity for a win, as we could see here. But by that time, they were both in bullet mode. Just seconds on the clock, just about a minute apiece. And in the end, a draw on board at the end of rapid game number 2. Carlsen with 3 inaccuracies, 1 mistake, 1 blunder, 21 average centi-pawn loss. We can see, if you compare the classical games to these rapid games, of course, the faster time controls, these more mistakes, more inaccuracies, blunders. are showing up. Average centi-pawn loss is a bit higher. On Karjakin's end, 5 inaccuracies, 0 mistakes, 1 blunder, 21 average centi-pawn loss. This takes us now into rapid game number 3. Karjakin gets his chance once more with Team White. Let's see how this would go. E4, E5, another. Ruy Lopez. Let's see how things are maybe different in this one. We once again have this A3, knight C3, but now knight A5. So throwing a quick punch at the bishop. And after bishop to E6, B4. So this is a little bit different. We haven't seen this yet in the match, B4. The move, B4. Striking at the knight, knight C6. Knight D5. So we're following, in a way, game number 11, but with one key difference, and that is the B pawns are both playing for each side. Knight D5, or knight D4, knight G5, and now bishop takes knight, pawn takes. It's important that the pawn take. A blunder would be bishop takes bishop because of knight takes bishop, and now white loses a piece. So pawn takes it is. White now has the bishop pair. Do the black knights have good squares is a nice follow-up question. The knight on D4, he can be kicked soon. Let's see what white goes for. Excuse me, black. Black plays knight to D7, striking at the knight. Knight to E4, F5, knight to D2, F4. So this is a super invasive pawn. What you don't want to allow is white, F3. Do not want to allow black's pawn to get to that square. It's just too cramping, making the G2 pawn flinch. This would create many holes on white's king side. So some great care is needed. So what does white do? First says, get away, get out of my house. The knight is flushed back. Knight F5, knight E4. Black has also given up a very strong square, a very strong post to the white knight on the E4 square. Queen E8, looking for G6. Bishop to B3, preparing a queenside break, and maybe even rerouting to this diagonal here. Queen G6, F3. So much for rerouting on this diagonal. White finds it important, I believe, to stop any ideas of F3 and is prepared to now meet any attack against G2 with maybe a rook lift, a queen lift, well, either rook. This could have been an additional reason behind bishop to B3. Rook A2 would defend the G2 point. Bishop to H4, right around this point. Bishop G3 may at some point be an idea. Just to show you, not saying in this exact variation, but maybe with a little bit more prep work, there could be an idea. This pawn on G3 can be a tremendous thorn in white's position, so white has to be on the lookout for this idea. It's an idea that I believe shows up in the King's Indian Defense Mar del Plata variation. You have to be on the lookout for this piece sacrifice. Again, with enough prep work, this can be something. So we have now some play on the queen side with A4, knight F6, queen to E2, getting some development in. Black's move is challenging the strong knight on E4. And now black goes forward with A5. Is black giving up a pawn? He is. Does white go for it? What's the idea behind the A5? Well, after A takes B4, now, if there isn't a pawn on C3, the knight on F5, which is probably the best black piece, would have an additional idea, both D4 and E3. So let's see what white does. Bishop to D2. He has no interest in capturing here and allowing knight to D4. That would strike against the queen and the bishop. So B takes C, bishop takes C, knight to E3, rook to C1. White has a responsibility here on G2 but so far is defending perfect. It's under some pressure here, but no problems. G2 is defended. Not quite sure what the bishop is doing on h4, unless black can make that work, but doesn't seem like it's going to work if the knight is on e3. Right, just to put it on. Captures, you're dropping another piece. So this is a lot less likely now that the knight is committed to the e3 square is what I'm getting at. One rook is exchanged, and black looks to reposition the queen. I thought the queen was maybe heading for this diagonal. Let's see, bishop to c4. This is a piece, haven't drawn any attention to this yet, but this is a piece that struggles some. It's true that white has the bishop pair, but of the two, it's really the c4 bishop, the light square bishop, that can, it's tough to get that bishop working. Right now, he's strictly Mr. Defender, just staring at his own pawns. So king to h8, getting out of any tricks that may be present on that diagonal. Bit of a waiting move as well. Karjakin, his time, well, Carlsen is about double the time. Let's see, knight takes knight, bishop takes. Rook to a3. And now we have e4. So it's a very interesting move to see. It's a gambit. Black is giving up a pawn for what reason? Well, after d takes c, and this is the best recapture, taking like this, there's always some concern of f3. This pawn becomes mobile if there isn't a white pawn on f3. So what does white do? D takes e, bishop takes bishop, rook takes. What's the idea here? Queen to e5. White is up a pawn, but black has some serious dark square control. This is a classic case of good knight versus bad bishop. But is it enough? The rook is hit. Where does he go? This is a super invasive piece, the knight on e3. How can black try to stir up some trouble? Rook to c1. Keep in mind the clock times. Rook a8. Flight square for the white king. Both kings have a flight square now. We see this in many cases in this match. Not just this match, but in general, when one side goes in for a flight square, the other side will often react with, yeah, I think it's time for me to make a flight square as well. h3, h6. King h2, and now queen to d4, slowly sneaking in a little bit more into the white position. Queen d4. There's pressure on the bishop, two attackers. There's two defenders though. Queen to e1. So can black not just win this bishop? Not so fast. On knight takes bishop, there would follow queen b4. White gets the piece back, and the knight for bishop, what just happened would be a knight for bishop exchange. Black definitely does not want this. This knight is far more valuable than the bishop. So he doesn't go for this. Instead, queen b2, threatening mate. Bishop f1, rook a2. Black is prepared to crash through on g2. What does white do? Rook takes c. And this is a blunder. And after black's next move, rook to a1, white simply resigns. Just, I guess, had a complete blind spot in, well, he didn't have much time remaining, but had a blind spot to this idea of rook to a1 hitting the queen. And when the queen moves, knight takes bishop with check. I mean, this will be leading to mate. Computer suggests you give up the queen for rook. It's that bad. So what would have been better is, instead of rook takes pawn, to try and chase the queen off of g2. It's rook to b1. Queen here, rook to c1. Some kind of perpetual attack against the queen for as long as she tries to stay here. And, you know, if we repeat, if Black really wants to stay here. Well, the queens are off, and king g1. White definitely isn't going to get mated. But yeah, the queens are off. The worst is in the past here. But we didn't have that. After rook to c7, again, rook takes pawn, rook a1, it went no further. Karjakin resigned. This was rapid game number 3, and this right here was a very big deal because Carlsen just won rapid game number 3 with the black pieces, which means he would have a very tall task in rapid game number 4. What is that task? Well, it's now a must-win or the match is over. Before we have a look at that final game, let me bring up the tail of the tape for this game here, rapid game number 3. Here we go. Having a look. It was pretty even until, after knight to f5, knight to e4, right around that point. Knight to f5, it started to like Team White. It wasn't a fan of knight to e4 so much, but it wasn't losing or anything. Definitely a bit of a tricky defense, and then we had that e4 move, pitching a pawn right around there, move 30. That's something to look into if you, in any of your games, if you identify one of your opponent's bishops as bad. In this game, there was a bad bishop. White's light square bishop was not contributing any way, and what we had in that ending was a very strong knight, as we saw on e3, versus a very bad bishop, and clearly a serious blunder for Karjakin in this one, grabbing the pawn, rook takes c7, and it's just all over. One more move, rook to a1, and that is it. 3 inaccuracies, 0 mistakes, 1 blunder, and that was a big one. That one blunder simply cost the game, but had very little time to work it out. That position, 37 average centi-pawn loss for Karjakin. Carlsen with 2 inaccuracies, 0 mistakes, 0 blunders, average centi-pawn loss of 12, which takes us into the 4th and final rapid game. And again, this is now win. Karjakin needs to win, or the match is over, and Carlsen will retain the title. If Karjakin wins, we would go next into the blitz. Let's see what happens in rapid game number 4. e4 by Carlsen. What opening would we have? Another Roy Lopez? No. c5, the Sicilian, for the first time in the match. And this may help to answer some questions. Many people through comments were wondering, why is the Sicilian not played? Well, yes, it's an aggressive opening, but White can still turn a Sicilian into, a bit more of a position, into more positional waters, let's say. So let's see what happens here. Knight f3, d6, open Sicilian, c takes d, knight takes d, knight f6, and I think this would be a bit of a surprise to see knight to c3 going into something maybe a little bit more sharp, but we have the option f3. It might be interesting to note that in 2013, game number 10, World Chess Championship, 2013 that is, Carlsen had the white pieces. Let me just back up. Carlsen had the white pieces. Anand playing black, he played c5. Knight f3, Anand played d6. And we had, at this moment, instead of d4, bishop to b5. And that went down a more positional path. White still has an option to take on a bit of a positional approach or a bit more of a controlled approach in this game, and we see that now at this moment here not with knight c3, but rather with f3, securing e4, and the key idea with this is to not obstruct the c-pawn. Why is this the case? Well, let's see. After e5, knight b3, bishop e7, c4. White wants to have the c-pawn contributing to control the center. So how will black stir up some trouble? White has a nice grip over d5 and also b5, both types of pawn breaks. Is f5 the way to try and create some pawn break? Let's see. a5, preparing to kick the knight away. White takes a timeout to deploy the queen bishop right now, so that after a4, the game move, knight c1, this knight can next reposition on d3. Castles, knight c3, pretty standard. There may be some idea connected with a3, undermining the knight who is pinned. So white breaks that pin straight away. Queen to d2, knight a6. Bishop to e2, not d3. That should be reserved for the knight. Knight c6 castles, bishop to d7. And now rook to b1, preparing a b4 advance. We do have that. Rook f to c8 is preparing to tuck the queen back. Black is anticipating what white wants to do here with b4. A takes b, en passant. En passant, capture. A takes b, A takes b. And now queen to d8. White was preparing to fork the queen and knight. So what does white do now? Knight to d3. Connecting rooks, and preparing to key in on the weakest square in black's camp, d5. The weakest square in white's camp is d4. Black is eyeing that up. Knight b4, bishop c6. There are many ideas for white in this position. You can hop right into d5, but keep in mind it's white who is working with a little bit more space, and so maybe is not so welcome to piece exchanges. This may set off a bit of a chain reaction with many minor piece captures. This is an option. One of the pieces to dive into d5. Another is to actually capture the bishop and then play b4, b5, weaken d5, and then jump in. White goes with none of the above. Gets another piece in play, rook f to d1, and it's tough to see how black tries to generate some play here. Let's see what he goes for. h5. So what's the idea here? He's trying to make one of these guys flinch. Stir up some trouble against the white king. h4, maybe h3. White is anticipating this now with bishop f1. h4, queen f2, not necessarily to pick up the pawn, but maybe sneak into b6. This pawn, queen takes pawn, if that's in, there can always be a knight move with the discovered attack against the queen and the knight on b4. He is, after all, that knight on b4 is unprotected. So what does black do? Knight to d7, defends the pawn directly, and rules out any bishop to b6. Maybe even knight c5 is right around the corner. g3 is opening up a new diagonal for the bishop. Rook a3, bishop h3, black doubles rooks, knight c2. Both of these knights are stopping the rooks from entering. Has to go back. The white knight returns to b4. Black has no interest in going back to a3. If a3, knight c2, and again, if this is a draw, Carlsen would retain his title, so black cannot afford this. And so after knight b4 goes rook a5, not a3. White would gladly repeat. Knight back to c2. And now b6. It's tough to see how black improves here. b6 is maybe preparing knight to c5, although on knight c5 there is this b4 move. We've seen this idea We saw this as a threat already. It's why the black queen went back home to avoid this b4 idea. So let's see what is tried next. White is preparing to double on the d file. Queen c7, the rooks are now doubled. Bishop f8, and now white picks up the h-pawn. So this gives up the f4 square. This is a bit weakening to give up the heart of your structure. G takes h did just that. So now in comes the knight. Knight to f4. Bishop takes knight. White is giving up the dark square bishop. And after e takes f, there's a new square for the knight on e5. So white takes out the knight before the knight can jump in there. That would be a very, very strong piece. So with these last two captures, what do we have here? Two bishops versus two knights. This is a pretty rare case. We haven't seen this, let's say, so much in this match. These types of imbalances. This is exactly what we have in this fourth rapid game. Which side will stand better? The big question is always, will the knights have good squares? Well, they do. There's d5, there's d4. Let's see what white does. Knight b4, hitting the bishop. And now rook to a3. If black tries to preserve the bishop, there is knight c to d5, and now there's going to be some big issue on b6. It's not just the win of a pawn, but there's some more piece, more material that will fall, that will hit with the fork. So rook a3 is tried, and now we have knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, similar to in rapid game number 3, where Carlsen had a knight on e3 versus a light square bishop. Now we have a knight that can reside on a light square and never be dislodged by the dark square bishop, of course. So it's another case of good knight versus bad bishop. Let's see what white tries here. First it's knight d5. This is giving up b3, but white would get the exchange. This is what black allows. The rook is hit. If the pawn is not picked up, then, I don't know, you can't go to a2. The knight could find a good post on d4. Black decides to go in for this imbalance, grabbing the b pawn, getting one pawn, allowing the fork, but black is getting a couple pawns in return. There goes now the c pawn. So two pawns and a minor piece were given up. And a rook versus a knight and two pawns, let's say. That's the big exchange. White got a rook, black got a knight and two pawns just then. And with that, there's now a passed b pawn. White needs to be careful that this bishop does not get too active. For example, if he can somehow quickly get to c5, that can be quite annoying. Okay, it's true white would have some moves, but still, just to bear down towards the white king position, there starts to be all of these different kind of mating nets right around the corner. Let's see if this bishop can get active. First queen e2, bishop e7, a step in the direction of maybe f6, somehow getting on this diagonal. King to g2. It's covering any entry point by the queen. h5 stops any checks. And now we have rook to a3. It's important black not be too welcome to a rook exchange, and definitely not a queen exchange. That would solve a lot of white's problems. There'd be less concern about king safety if the queens are off. As it stands right now, the black king is a little bit more comfortable, I believe, a little bit more airy white king position. So rook a3, rook d3. Rook a2 is now met with rook 3 to d2. Black cannot continue in this way because, again, white would be fine even though objectively white is better here, white would be fine with a draw. Black has to try something else and does. After rook a3, rook d3, rook a7. Rook to d4 not only defends the pawn, but consider all of these squares. The king is shielded. There isn't a way to give a successful check to the white king, so white has this square covered now. The rook is stopping the queen from observing a2 directly. Rook c7, queen d2, looking to pick up the pawn. Queen f6, rook f5, this pawn is now hit twice. Queen h4, white offers a rook exchange first. White could go straight in for this, but says, I want to get to an open file first, knowing that black really can't afford a rook exchange. So the rook avoids the exchange. Only now does white pick up the f4 pawn. Black gives a check, having one rook on the second. King h1. White has this covered. Queen f2. Black is threatening a mate in one, but white is on move. The game follows on this move 49. Rook to c8. If bishop to f8, rook takes bishop, king takes rook, and this would be leading to checkmate. And if bishop to f8, rook takes bishop, king takes, if the king goes in the other direction, this too would be leading to checkmate in many different ways. Wherever the king goes, you make a queen move to give check, etc., etc. after rook to c8. And one last variation, let's say after check, king here, queen f5. If the king is going to c7, there's queen to c8 for mate. So there's a lot of different mates with the king running to the queen side, but it's all forced. In the game, we did not have bishop to f8, however. In the game, we had king to h7, and we had exactly one more move played before this match is over. Can you spot the final move of the 2016 World Chess Championship match? If you'd like to, pause the video. What move would you play in this position? Okay, the star move that capped off the 2016 World Chess Championship match. You ready for it? Queen to h6, and Karjakin resigned. With all of these different draws throughout the tournament, a lot of Roy Lopez's, a lot of draws, a lot of level games, and out of nowhere now, in this rapid game, this fourth and final rapid game, queen h6, a sacrifice of the queen, and black simply resigned here. Why exactly? What happens if king takes queen? There's only two options. King takes queen is met with rook h8 mate. Pawn takes queen is met with rook takes pawn, and that too is mate. What a star move to cap off the 2016 World Chess Championship match. Again, black resigned here, and with that, Carlsen retains, he defends his World Chess Championship title. Black was just a moment away from giving a mate right here, but of course white was on move and had this fantastic finish, I must say, with queen to h6. It's not every game, let alone every World Chess Championship match, where you get to pull off or really finish a match with a move like queen to h6, a queen sacrifice. So, with that, in the tiebreak section, Carlsen finished with 3 points to Karjakin's 1, and that is a wrap. If we have a look at the tail of the tape for this one, here we go. And here we go. Yes, just a little bit of an advantage. And it's really tough. You're asking a lot at this level for the player playing with the black pieces to try and win. A little bit of ups and downs, but never a situation where white was in any danger. It was either equal or, clearly some type of advantage throughout the whole game. And yes, capped off with, it doesn't get really any better than that kind of a final move, queen to h6. At the end of it all, rapid game 4-4. Carlsen had 4 inaccuracies, 3 mistakes, 0 blunders. Average centi-pawn loss, 22. Karjakin with 4 inaccuracies, 3 mistakes, 1 blunder. Average centi-pawn loss of 42. So, what more can I add? It's been quite a ride. You could hear my voice being a bit worn right around this stage. Carlsen's rapid rating, for those interested in ratings, has gone over 2,900. I believe it's in the live ratings 2,908 with these 2 rapid game wins. So, yeah, well, the big thing here is that he defended his title. Hats off to both players. Karjakin, as we saw throughout, was a fantastic defender and also one who was well capable of striking when his opponent slipped up. We saw that in Game 8. And he was the one who drew first blood in this match. Let's not forget that. Carlsen could have even slipped up in Game 9, feeling that pressure. Held the draw in Game 9 with the black pieces and only struck back even in Game 10. Quite a ride this 2016 World Chess Championship was. I enjoyed covering it as usual on both YouTube and Twitch. Thank you for tuning in to it all. If you've been tracking this channel throughout, I appreciate your support throughout all of it. I hope to be able to do this the next time the World Chess Championship cycle comes around. Feel free to connect if you haven't already to this channel. I look forward to producing much more content beyond just this type of coverage for the World Chess Championship match. Next World Championship, there's an off year in 2017, so I hope to be back covering the event similar to how I did this year for 2018. So thanks again for your support. It really does mean a lot to me, and I hope you enjoyed this match as much as I did. So thank you again, and I will catch you soon. That is all for now. Take care. Bye.